I'm going to ask you to vote for the motion, which is a vote of realism, not of pessimism, realism about the divisions within the North and how they can't be fixed by current devolution policies. After all, we're told we need the Northern Powerhouse because the standard measure of output, GVA, across the whole of the North is half that of London. Well, here's something else for you. Output per head in Oldham or Bolton is 55% of South Manchester. Output in Bradford or Huddersfield is 65% of Leeds. The idea of the North is a lazy way of avoiding the issue of what's gone wrong in Bradford, Bolton, or East Manchester. 50 or 100 years ago, these were amongst the richest places in the world, as you can see from their remaining architecture. And they were rich because they exported textiles and engineering to the rest of the world. And they failed not because of their own faults, but partly because of political decisions. In textiles, the key was the national political decision on free trade with low-wage areas, so British consumers got cheap clothing and British workers lost their jobs, which aren't coming back. I'm talking to you in an imported shirt, and every man in the audience is wearing a cheap imported shirt. That's what's gone wrong in the North. Manufacturing employment down from 25 to 9%, and the largest remaining sector, food processing for the national market. Now, Osborne's policy response is the March of the Makers. And it's unkind but necessary to tell you that that was his second slogan. That his current slogan is Northern Powerhouse. The old one was March of the Makers. And you remember that one didn't happen, as you can see from the trade deficit, output, and investment. And Northern Powerhouse isn't going to happen either, because Osborne's got the theory wrong and ignores the practicalities of policy. On the theory, at this point, it's going to become rather academic, and I can give you the references after. But essentially, Northern Powerhouse is based on a kind of economics which is called agglomeration theory. And it argues that the dynamics of cities and regions are internal, and that if you weld them together, as in the North through transport improvement, then you can turn the northern cities into one big market where density will, in some mysterious way, produce economic growth and high incomes. Now, the interesting thing is that this completely ignores the whole weight of historical research for the past 100 years on cities, which says that cities and regions grow prosperous by their relation to a broader hinterland, that they export goods, they take a clip on trade, that they're political capitals of larger areas. And all of this, of course, depends on political rules and regulations. And I think it's very interesting from this point of view to turn away from the failure of the North and think how neatly the success of London fits into the historical account from people like Brodel or Charles Tilley. Because London's success is based on two things. Firstly, it's the national capital of a medium-sized centralized state, which brings it, for example, 75,000 civil servants. And it's also the EU's financial centre, which brings it 350,000 in financial services. Now, the whole booster literature says, isn't London wonderful, that it's some kind of compost heap which creates jobs and high incomes? The disproof of that is to think of what happens if the British electorate votes for Brexit. What will happen is very clear. In the first instance, the City of London will be diminished because France and Germany will build their financial services against the City of London. And secondly, it's likely the Scots will insist on the breakup of the UK, which will leave London as the capital of a substantially smaller state. So, in a sense, Osborne is punting on agglomeration theory and this mysterious dynamic against all kind of reasoning about how cities depend on political relations to a hinterland. And beyond that, I think he's not only got the theory wrong, he's also got the practicalities wrong. Now, we can talk about transport skills and a variety of things. As time is short, I'm going to talk simply about transport. Essentially, the Northern Powerhouse depends on transport delivering a travel-to-work solution. Now, transport improvement is hugely overdue in Manchester, but it's not going to deliver a travel-to-work solution. It hasn't so far. Think, for example, of Bolton, which is by train 15 to 18 minutes away from Manchester Oxford Road, and no changes, and yet only 7% of Bolton's residents work in Manchester City. What's got wrong? Why is the magic fix of transport improvement not working? Two reasons. First reason is the middle class standard on transport is always time saved on the journey. If it's quick, it's bound to work. Well, of course it does if you're middle class and you've got an income. The low paid standard is the fare charged. Return train fare from Bolton to the centre of Manchester, £6.40. From Oldham by tram to the centre of Manchester, £5.40. And if you're working at JD Sports on a 0 hours contract, that's your first hour's wages gone. So, the transport thing is hokum unless you lower the fares. And the second point is, even if you do lower the fares, it ain't going to work because, of course, private property developers have been allowed to rampage over the centres of Leeds and Manchester for the last 30 years. And as a result of that, we've built huge numbers of small, cheap flats in or near the centre. Look at the bottom of Deansgate. Since 1991, Manchester City has added 30,000 small private flats to its housing stock. And that's, I suppose, sleeping accommodation for 50,000 junior white collars who don't need to commute from the suburbs. The whole thing about transport is it's not going to work. It's the wrong theory and the practicalities are misunderstood. And beyond that, I think, I've been talking about the economics. I'd still buy into it if we'd got the right powers. But as Ivan has been telling you, politically, it's the wrong deal. Now, I think what happened is that although Lees and Bernstein are clever players, regional politicians were flattered by being offered some powers and a bit of revenue from business rates. They didn't get adequate powers. And adequate powers would have included not only revenue raising of a significant sort, but borrowing powers. I ask you, would you take over a struggling company if they told you you couldn't have control of the balance sheet? Why should you take over a struggling city region if you don't control borrowing? And the outcome is, as Ivor's been telling you, so far the outcome is responsibility without power. In health and adult care, which is the big risk, we have not devolution, but delegated responsibility for management of underfunded services after a process of austerity cuts. And one does rather suspect that this is going to end in blame for somebody, not in credit, and at that point, central government will be smiling quietly up its sleeve. And all of this is garnished with no kind of democracy of the sort which Ivan's been talking about, but with the gimmick of elected mayors and talk of leadership. Our electors didn't want elected mayors, let me remind you. And in the USA, if you actually look at the turnout for elected mayors, it runs continuously downward towards an average of somewhere in the low 30s, which is actually worse than Manchester local government. And of course the politicians promise more engagement, and the honest ones want more engagement. But the fact of the matter is that our politicians have got into the habit locally of intra-elite deals. The whole business of the devolution deal from the Treasury to Manchester, and also the intra-elite deals which determine the pattern of property development. Think about the cut-and-dried planning permissions and the public loans for more cheap 1- and 2-bedroom flats on the Pomona site, with 80,000 people on the waiting list for social housing. So a vote for the motion is, as I said at the beginning, a vote for realism, about how little the Northern Powerhouse can change, a vote for the beginning of wisdom about how these policies and powers are inadequate, and a vote above all for starting a post-devolution debate, a debate about
Karel,
new welfare measures. Job creation won't solve our problems, and about the need for social innovation in things like that.
Thank you, Karel.